So just starting with some naphtha, start cleaning this up. That mark over here is where the satin chrome has been rubbed, so it's a bright spot. That's not going to come off. It's okay, that won't be seen. That was rubbed by the focus scale ring, so of course it'll be covered by the focus scale ring, so that particular little scar will never be seen unless and until somebody else takes the camera apart. And this camera must be just somewhere between 65 and 70 years old, so there's a reasonable likelihood that no one else will ever have cause to take it apart again. So the first step here is to clean this. Once I've got it clean, I can inspect it more easily, and I'll be inspecting it for any signs of damage. The sorts of damage that you get with struts like this, of course, are anything that's bent. Things can be bent. That's it. Quite common for things to be bent. Corrosion can cause a problem. Very infrequently something might actually be broken or cracked, but that would be quite uncommon. These struts look to be in generally very good order. One thing that can happen is, if people have been particularly rough with them, is that these tracks here and here, where that rivet slides backwards and forwards, they can be stretched open, so that at the point where this is locked in the open position, you might find that you've got a rattle here because the gap here is too wide, and that can usually be dealt to by closing the struts a little bit. Let's get this closed a bit, and simply crushing this piece in the jaws of a vice slightly to tighten it back up. That works quite well, and it can be useful to take the rattle out where there's undue rattle in the struts. In this case that feels pretty good. You can also get movement in the pivots too, of course. And remember, the door acts as an extra support top and bottom at this point, which also helps to brace the struts, and indeed the tension of the bellows on the back tends to help brace the struts as well. So it's not all relying solely on these pieces for rigidity. Well, that's looking pretty good now. That's quite clean. So what I'm looking at now is the state of the arms on here. Get that out of the way. Now the inner arms should be flat. There should be no real bend in those at all. They look pretty good. And the outer arms here, on those cross struts, they should be slightly dished, so that when this is fixed in the body, it provides outward tension on these points so that they click into position when they're fully extended. So I'm just looking at the state of those arms to make sure that they've got a satisfactory dish to them. One's certainly got more than the other. That's plenty, that's heaps. It's easy to overdo that, in which case the struts just become quite stiff to extend. Alright, that looks good. That's certainly ready to go back into a camera body. but I've really got to wait for my parts to come back from the cleaning before I can do much more with that. What else have I got to clean first? Oh yeah, I suppose this piece next. This is the focus mount. This is cast, some sort of, I think it's aluminium. It's cast and it'll be very sticky with dried grease. So usually I just start cleaning up the top surface where this screws back to the front standard, and then start on the recess here where the outer helical runs. And the grease may clean away quite easily with a bit of naphtha and a bit of work like this, or it might be quite dried up. If it's gone very hard, like a hard dry wax, you have to shift it with a toothpick, or a wooden bamboo skewer can be useful for that. I don't recommend poking and prodding at it with screwdrivers. You'll end up scarring the metal, which will mean that there'll inevitably be high spots left behind, and those high spots will mean that nothing will move smoothly. That grease is a bit harder. I'm going to have to poke at that with a toothpick. Oh yeah, it's very hard. Using a more energetic solvent can sometimes be useful to shift dried grease like that. The one I mostly use in that case is CRC Lectra Clean, which is, I can't remember what it's made of now. Something good. It's more energetic than this. You've got to be careful where you use it because it'll damage leatherettes when you're working on cameras with leatherettes. And leatherettes are typically a cloth base that's been impregnated with some plastic material, and the plastic material probably differed from one manufacturer's leatherette to another. But plastics are always usually susceptible to damage from solvents. And depending on what camera you're working on and what solvents you're using, you may or may not have any problem at all. Or it could be a total disaster. Something that you tend to learn from experience. That's pretty good, but I've got some grease stuck behind these two posts. The two posts here and here are the guide posts for the inner helical. They prevent the inner helical revolving. You can only move backwards and forwards. That looks pretty good. I think one more wipe through there and I'll be happy. Just going to crush one of these cotton buds down dead flat with my pliers so that I can get that cotton bud in behind those struts, those posts. even when you think you've got it clean and free from grease, if you clean it once more you might find that there's still grease coming off. That's looking good on that surface, nothing came off. A bit came off there. Alright, I'm happy with the state of that. Now I'll go and see if my parts have finished in the ultrasonic cleaner. They've already been through the solvent stage, and I'm just now putting them through the detergent stage to shift the last remaining rubbish. Well, here are the parts back from cleaning, and now all I've got to do is sort them out as I go so that the parts are there ready for me to grab through the assembly process. I'll start putting the struts back in the body now. Before I do that, I'll take some molybdenum paste and lubricate this shutter release shaft here. It doesn't need much, just putting a very fine wipe on there. And where it runs on the shaft in the camera body, I'll just run some up in there. And as for the lubricating the struts themselves, I'll put some synthetic grease in the slots at the back here. But I won't put any in the front slots because it'll only end up getting wiped off with my fingers while I'm working. Let's take some molybdenum paste, just rub it on that post. It looks like I was putting virtually nothing on there, it's because I was putting virtually nothing on there. Little is needed. The transfer shaft needs to go in. This is what takes the action from the cocking rack at the back of the camera body through to the front of the shutter. That sits down here in the body. You have to hook it under the edge of the bellows at the back there. It drops into place nicely. Its little support bracket sits in there, and that's held in place with the screw that holds the struts in position. Now to get the struts swung into place, it's always entertaining getting this quite right. Now this swivel piece here, the short end goes onto the shaft here. Get that swung into position. Now I've got to get the struts in without disturbing that shaft, the shaft in its bracket there. That should go in. If I squeeze that across, it's dropped in. Yeah, I've managed to achieve that. I've got the struts in there without disturbing the position of that bracket. I can line that up with my tweezers. I've got 4 screws that went in those positions. 2 of them should be nice and shiny from the film cassette well. One of them will be a little bit uglier than the others because it came out from the under the Leatherettes. This one here will do for the top. That screw run down. Just run that lightly in place. That traps that bracket, which in turn traps the transfer shaft in place. Now, at the corresponding position at the bottom, we've got a spacer washer that goes in there. I'll just drop that in against the here, pull that back with the tip of my tweezers. Check that I've got the alignment correct. Take the ugliest of the 4 screws that had the paint on it. run that through, and again do that up very lightly. So that's trapped the washer, the spacer washer in place. The bracket's trapped there. I've only got my 2 screws here that go in the film cassette chamber. Of course today there's no back on the camera, so it's a bit easier to see what I'm doing. It's not lining up. Let's just see if I can check that brackets, that the holes are lined up. Let's try one in the other position. That started straight away. Let's try the first one again. That started nicely. So with 4 screws in position, I can now go around and tighten those 4 screws up. And that is the struts back in the camera body. Make sure that shaft lines up, yes, and they'll collapse back neatly. And you can see they've got a bit of spring on them, where they're pushed out by the springs at the back. So the focus mount can go in here next. Well, here I've got the focus mount, so making sure these arms are pushed back out of the way. Put my focus mount in place, and that's held in place with 4 screws, countersunk screws, fairly large diameter heads, quite short in the thread, one at each corner. Wait until you've got all the screws started before you go around and tighten them up. If there's any misalignment, it can be very hard to get things to the last screw in if you've rushed around and tightened them all up first. Get that. I'll just collapse the bellows down, the struts down a bit, so I'm not pressing on the struts and distorting them. Do those 4 screws up tight. That's good. That's our focus mount in place. And I can put the 4 screws in that hold the bellows to the back of the front standard. They're black screws. Go through here. There's 4 of them. Go through at the corners. They're not evenly spaced. It's just the way it is. They should pick up the screw holes pretty much straight away. Sometimes you've got to wriggle them about a bit, particularly if you've replaced the bellows and the alignment's not spot on. The alignment was probably never spot on, but over time the bellows will have adjusted to the position of the fixing screws. Once they're all in place, you can tighten them up. Don't go mad doing them up. You're going in through layers of leather and cloth, and it's a little bit compressible. It's very hard to tell when they're dead tight. So there we have the struts back in, the bellows connected back up again, and that just requires the focus mount stuff to be the helical in there next, which is here. I'll start by assembling the outer and inner helical together. I'm pleased that that runs very smoothly, and I can see a minor complication. Got the marks that I made on here, but there's also similar marks that somebody else made on a previous occasion. So I'm going to have to shuffle this around a bit until I've got things where they probably were. I can probably judge all of those marks will line up with something somewhere. I think I like that. Looks good. Now I'm just going to get that in the right place, which is at least one notch further around. That's it. I see a little flake of loose paint coming out there. Let's get rid of him. Actually, is that paint or is it paper? Don't know. Right, so I'm quite happy with that. The alignment marks here, 2 there, they're not my ones. My ones are here. And there was an opposite one over here that's been scribed in. And ideally I should have scribed it across there. I picked up the wrong one to copy. So there are multiple marks on here, but I'm quite confident that's the way it should be. So that's good. So I'm just checking the feel of that helical, checking that it's smooth. It does appear good. Put a bit of naphtha on there and work that backwards and forwards a few times. If there are any rough spots, often that's enough, working it with a bit of naphtha as a lubricant for the brass to rub down the high spots on its opposite component. That feels very good. So assuming that's correct, that will sit in the body that way up, because I normally have 2 marks at the bottom and 1 mark at the top. That way. We'll check if that moves smoothly, and it does. Moves smoothly there, so that all looks good. It just requires lubricant, and I need my Helimax XP optical and helicoid instrument grease. So I've got these correctly aligned relative to each other, so I'm not going to back them completely out, so I've only got to go through finding the right spot again. I've put some grease around the outside here in 5 or 6 places. Just like that. Run that in, work that backwards and forwards. Check that it moves smoothly, and it does. That's good. I'll run some round the outer helical here, where this is going to run in the mount. And a touch where this is going to run on the posts, and it's going to run on the posts where the little holes show here and here. Bring the body back. That's the way it was. Just check that action again. feels fine. The focus and mechanism, of course, in this camera was just about bound right up. Nothing really wanted to move. So I'm just running some grease around the back edge of this retainer plate. It doesn't need much, just needs a touch. And the retainer plate only fits on in one direction, so it's not hard to discover where that is. And that's held in place with 6 screws. It's worth making sure that the inner helical is not back hard inside there when you do these screws up, otherwise you may find you're fighting with it. If in fact the inner helical's back so far that it's hitting the back of the mount. Not that screw hole. Oops, I'll cover that one in a second. That's good.